Tonight, we're stepping onto two school campuses, but before we start the stories, I want to give respect where respect is due. Historically, Black colleges and universities have one of the richest legacies in American education. For generations, these schools have educated Black students at times when many other institutions either refused to open their doors to us or made it nearly impossible for us to succeed. These schools have produced doctors, lawyers, teachers, scientists, artists, business leaders, activists, politicians, and countless everyday people who went back into their communities and made a difference. There's a reason the HBCU experience means so much to so many families. The traditions, the homecomings, the bands, the Greek life, the friendships, and that feeling of walking across a campus knowing generations came before you. That history is powerful. But y'all already know what channel you clicked on. Around here, we also know that even places with beautiful histories can have stories hiding in the shadows. The older a place is, the more memories it collects. And sometimes those memories turn into legends that get passed from one generation of students to the next. Every campus seems to have that one building people talk about, that one hallway students don't like walking through alone at night, or that one story upperclassmen tell freshmen just to see whether they can scare them. So turn the lights down unless you're already in a dorm room because you might want to leave those lights on. Get comfortable, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you subscribed. This is Tales from the Hood, and you're watching Surviving My HBCU. I had wanted to attend Hampton University long before I ever filled out an application. Growing up, I heard people talk about HBCUs all the time, but Hampton was different to me because the more I read about the school, the more I felt like there was something special about being part of a place with that much history. Hampton was founded in 1868, only a few years after slavery ended, originally as the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. And some of the people who walked those grounds had stories that went back to a completely different America. Booker T. Washington had attended Hampton before eventually becoming one of the most influential Black educators in the country, and the university had educated generations of Black students who went on to become teachers, doctors, business owners, artists, politicians, and leaders. When I looked at pictures of the campus, I didn't just see classrooms and dormitories. I saw old brick buildings, huge trees, and generations of Black history sitting right beside the water in Hampton, Virginia. I remember telling my mother that if Hampton accepted me, that was where I was going. I didn't care who else accepted me. When that acceptance letter finally came, my mother screamed louder than I did. My grandmother called everybody she knew. My father bought me a Hampton sweatshirt before we even knew how we were going to pay for everything, and for the rest of my senior year, I felt like my life was already beginning. I was leaving home, going to an HBCU, and finally getting the chance to become my own person. I spent that entire summer watching videos about Hampton, reading about campus traditions, looking at pictures of dorm rooms, and trying to imagine what my first year would be like. I read about the school's history, but I also started finding little stories that weren't included on the official university pages. Students talked about old buildings, strange noises, and campus legends that had been passed down from one class to another. I never paid much attention to those stories because every old college has ghost stories. If a building has been standing for more than 100 years, somebody is eventually going to claim they saw a woman in a hallway at 3 in the morning. Move-in day came at the end of summer, and I can still remember the feeling I had when we drove onto campus. Cars were everywhere. Parents were unloading refrigerators and plastic storage bins. Students were hugging people they hadn't seen all summer, and music was coming from somewhere across campus. My mother kept asking me whether I had everything, while my father complained about how much stuff I had packed. I was nervous, but it was the good kind of nervous. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When we finally reached my residence hall, I remember looking up at the building and thinking about how old some of the structures around Hampton were. There was something beautiful about it. But there was also something about those older buildings that made you wonder how many people had lived inside them before you. My roommate's name was Carla, and thankfully, we clicked almost immediately. She was from Maryland, talked more than I did, and had brought enough clothes to stay at Hampton for 6 years instead of 4. By the time our parents left, we had already figured out whose side of the room was whose, where the television was going, and which one of us was going to have to buy more extension cords. That first night was everything I imagined college would be. People kept walking into our room introducing themselves. Somebody down the hall had music playing too loud. Girls were talking about parties. And everybody was trying to figure out who was cool and who was weird. At some point, 5 or 6 of us ended up sitting around talking about the campus. And one of the older students mentioned a name I had seen online before I arrived. Kitty. The room changed the second she said it. A couple of girls laughed, but another girl immediately told her not to start talking about Kitty at night. That made everybody laugh even harder, including me. I asked who Kitty was, even though I vaguely remembered reading something about the legend, and the older student told us the version that Hampton students had apparently been passing down for years. According to the story, Kitty was a young woman connected to Virginia Cleveland Hall sometime in the 1800s. The legend said she became pregnant and died after unaliving herself in the attic of the building. Nobody seemed to know Kitty's last name, exactly what year it supposedly happened, or whether there was any historical documentation proving the story. What everybody agreed on was that generations of students had heard about her, and some claimed Kitty never left. I immediately started asking questions, because parts of the story didn't make sense to me. If this supposedly happened in the 1800s, where was the newspaper article? Where was the death certificate? Where was anything proving there had actually been a girl named Kitty? The older student shrugged and told me that was why it was called a legend. Then she started telling us what students claimed happened inside the building. Some said they heard footsteps above them when nobody was upstairs. Others claimed doors opened by themselves, or that they woke up feeling somebody standing beside their beds. One girl supposedly saw a woman at the end of a hallway and watched her disappear around a corner. The older student told us that certain rooms had more stories connected to them than others, and by the time she finished, Carla had pulled her blanket halfway over her face. I laughed and told everybody they were not about to scare me out of a school my parents were paying good money for. Carla agreed, although she didn't sound nearly as confident as I did. We joked about Kitty for the rest of the night, and eventually everybody went back to their rooms. Before going to sleep, Carla looked over at me and asked whether I believed any of it. I told her absolutely not. I believed somebody probably heard an old pipe banging 50 years ago, told somebody else it was a ghost, and the story grew every time it was repeated. Carla laughed and said that was exactly what she thought too. For the first couple of weeks, nothing happened. Classes started, assignments piled up faster than I expected, and the excitement of being away from home slowly turned into the reality of actually being a college student. Carla and I developed our routines. She usually stayed up later than I did, while I liked getting up early before class. Some nights we would sit around talking until 1 or 2 in the morning, and other nights one of us would be asleep while the other studied. Kitty became nothing more than another campus story we occasionally joked about. Then one Tuesday night, I woke up because somebody was walking around our room. I didn't open my eyes immediately because I assumed it was Carla. I could hear slow movement near the foot of my bed, followed by what sounded like somebody brushing against one of our storage containers. I remember lying there irritated because I had an 8 o'clock class and figured Carla was looking for something in the dark. Finally, I whispered her name and told her to stop making so much noise. Carla answered me from her bed. She sounded half asleep. She asked what I was talking about. I opened my eyes and looked across the room. Carla was underneath her blanket, staring back at me. Nobody else was there. The room was dark, except for a little light coming through the blinds, and for several seconds, neither of us moved. I eventually turned on the lamp and checked around the room, but there was obviously nowhere for somebody to hide. The door was locked. Nothing had fallen. I told Carla I must have dreamed it, and she accepted that explanation because neither one of us wanted another one. 2 nights later, Carla heard it. This time I was awake. We were both lying in bed when 3 slow knocks came from somewhere above us. We stopped talking immediately. After maybe 10 seconds, there were 3 more knocks. Simone sat up and looked at me, and I could already tell what she was thinking. I told her it was probably plumbing or somebody moving around somewhere else in the building. Then the knocking came again, except this time it sounded closer, almost like it was coming from inside the wall behind my bed. Carla said, "Don't say her name." I laughed because I was nervous and told her she was being ridiculous, but neither one of us slept much that night. After that, little things started happening every few days. Nothing dramatic enough to make us run screaming from the building, but enough to make us uncomfortable. My desk drawer would be open when I knew I had closed it. Simone swore somebody touched the back of her hair while she was studying. One morning we woke up and our closet door was wide open, even though both of us remembered closing it. Another night, my phone charger disappeared from beside my bed and turned up underneath Carla's desk. We blamed each other for things until we realized neither one of us was joking anymore. The worst part was how normal everything felt during the daytime. I would walk across Hampton's campus, surrounded by students going to class, laughing, eating, talking on their phones, and I would convince myself that we were being stupid. This was a university, not some haunted house attraction. I had professors giving me assignments and friends asking where we were going that weekend. Then nighttime would come. The hallways would get quiet, and every little sound inside that old building seemed louder. Eventually, I started researching Kitty again. That was when the story stopped being funny to me. I learned that the legend wasn't something a few current students had invented. Stories about Kitty had apparently circulated among Hampton women for generations, particularly around Virginia Cleveland Hall. I even found references describing a specific upper room, room D4, and claims connected to the upper portions of the building. The basic story was always similar. A young pregnant woman, a death supposedly involving the attic, and a presence students believed remained afterward. I still couldn't find reliable historical documentation proving that a woman named Kitty had actually died there, which should have made me feel better. Instead, it bothered me more. Because if nobody could prove she existed, why had people been telling essentially the same story for so long? About a month into the semester, Carla left campus for the weekend to visit her family. She asked me to come with her, but I had work to finish and didn't feel like spending several hours riding in a car, so I stayed. That Saturday night, I went out with friends and came back sometime after midnight. The building was quieter than usual because a lot of students were gone. I showered, got into bed, watched videos on my phone for maybe 30 minutes, and eventually fell asleep. I woke up sometime later because I felt somebody looking at me. I know that sounds strange. You can't technically feel somebody looking at you, but anybody who has ever awakened and immediately known someone else was in the room understands exactly what I mean. My eyes opened, and before I even moved my head, I saw somebody standing beside my bed. A woman. She was so close that for the first second, I thought Carla had come back early. Then my eyes adjusted. The woman was wearing something long and pale that looked nothing like modern clothing, Her hair hung around her face, and her head was tilted slightly downward like she was studying me. I couldn't make out every feature, but I could see enough to know that whoever was standing beside my bed was not Carla. I tried to scream and nothing came out. I squeezed my eyes shut because my mind was telling me this had to be sleep paralysis. I had heard about people waking up and seeing figures that weren't actually there. I told myself to count to 5 and open my eyes again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I opened them. She was still there. This time her face was closer. I jumped so hard that I hit the wall beside my bed, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The second the light came on, nobody was there. I didn't investigate. I didn't check the closet. I didn't look underneath anything. I grabbed my keys, ran out of that room wearing the clothes I had slept in, and spent the rest of the night in another student's room. When Carla returned Sunday evening, she could tell something was wrong before I even told her. I explained exactly what happened, and instead of laughing, she got quiet. Then she told me something she had never mentioned before. A few nights earlier, she had awakened and seen someone standing beside my bed. She said she thought it was me at first until she looked over and realized I was asleep. So then she thought she was seeing things because she blinked and the figure was gone. That was when I stopped calling it a legend because she was real. We requested a room change, but we didn't tell anybody the real reason because we didn't want people thinking we were crazy. While we waited, we started sleeping with the television on. We kept lights on. We stopped talking about Kitty completely. For several nights, nothing happened, and I started thinking maybe whatever we had experienced was over. Then things got worse. One night, Carla woke me up around 3 in the morning because she heard crying. It was faint at first, almost like somebody was crying somewhere down the hallway. We sat there listening until we realized the sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from above us. The crying continued for several minutes, soft and broken, and then suddenly stopped. A few seconds later, something dragged across the ceiling. Not footsteps, dragging. It moved slowly from one side of the room to the other before stopping directly above my bed. Then we heard 3 knocks. I don't remember deciding to leave the room. I only remember Carla and me running down the hallway. After that night, we practically stopped sleeping there. We stayed with friends whenever possible and only returned during the day to get clothes and school supplies. My grades started slipping because I was exhausted. I stopped paying attention in class. My mother could hear something was wrong whenever we talked, but I kept telling her I was homesick because explaining the truth sounded ridiculous even to me. The final incident happened in the middle of the afternoon one day. That's the part that still bothers me because until then, everything strange had happened at night. Carla and I returned to the room between classes to grab our laptops. The sun was shining through the window, students were talking in the hallway, and we finally felt safe enough to laugh about how paranoid we had become. Carla was standing near her desk when she suddenly stopped talking and looked toward the doorway. Her face changed completely. I turned around. There was a woman standing in the hallway. She was maybe 15 feet away, wearing a long, pale dress. Her head was lowered, and her hair partially covered her face. I saw her. Carla saw her. Neither one of us said anything. Then the woman slowly lifted her head and looked directly into our room. I slammed the door. Carla started crying, and I immediately called my mother. I didn't care how crazy I sounded anymore. I told her everything. The footsteps, the knocking, the crying, the woman beside my bed, and what Carla and I had just seen in the hallway. My mother was silent for several seconds before telling me to pack my things and come home. I wish I could tell you I stayed at Hampton, conquered my fear, and eventually laughed about everything that happened. I didn't. I finished as much of that semester as I could while staying with friends, but eventually I withdrew and transferred to another school. Carla left too, although she lasted longer than I did. People told us we had allowed an old campus legend to get inside our heads. Maybe they were right. Maybe the footsteps were pipes. Maybe the crying came from somewhere else in the building. Maybe the woman beside my bed was sleep paralysis, and maybe Carla and I somehow convinced ourselves that we saw the same woman in that hallway. That's what I tell myself whenever I think about Hampton. People can tell me Kitty is only a Hampton University legend, and maybe historically that's all anyone can prove. I can't give you a last name. I can't give you a death certificate. I can't even prove the story about what supposedly happened in that attic is true. The only thing I can tell you is that I went to Hampton because I really fell in love with its history. And I left because I became convinced that some of that history was still walking around. I'm not going to say the name of the HBCU I attended, and I'm doing that on purpose. I'll tell you that it's a popular one, the kind of school most people have heard of even if they never attended an HBCU themselves. And if I gave you the city or even a few details about the campus, somebody would probably figure it out within 5 minutes. I'm also changing the names of everyone involved, including the sorority, because even after all these years, there are still people connected to what happened who would rather this story stay buried. What happened to me started during my sophomore year, but if I'm being truthful, the groundwork was laid the minute I stepped onto that campus as a freshman. I was 18 years old, away from home for the first time, and completely in love with college life. There was something powerful about walking across that campus every day and seeing Black professors, Black administrators, Black students from every part of the country, people who looked like me studying engineering, medicine, law, education, business, and everything in between. Homecoming felt like a family reunion with thousands of relatives you had never met before. The band could make the entire stadium shake, and people dressed like celebrities just to walk across the yard between classes. Everybody had something going on. Whether it was student government, dance teams, campus organizations, fraternities, sororities, or some kind of community service group, and I remember calling my mother during my first week and telling her that for the first time in my life I felt like I had found exactly where I was supposed to be. There was one sorority on campus that everybody seemed to know, and I'm going to call them Theta Rho Sigma, even though that was not their real name. Their members carried themselves like campus royalty, and everywhere they went, people seemed to notice. They were beautiful, but that wasn't the only reason they stood out. Some of them were student leaders. Some worked closely with admissions and campus organizations. Others already had internships lined up with major companies. And whenever they hosted a service event, scholarship program, food drive, or mentoring program, people showed up. Watching from the outside, I thought they represented everything I wanted to become. Confident, successful, connected, respected, and part of something bigger than themselves. My freshman roommate used to tease me because anytime those women walked into the student center, she caught me looking and she would laugh and say, "Girl, just admit you want to be one." I would act like I hadn't decided yet, but the truth was I already had. I had started researching their history, going to public events, keeping my grades high, volunteering, joining other organizations, and trying to make sure I carried myself the way I thought somebody connected to that sorority should carry themselves. By sophomore year, I finally felt ready, and that fall there were whispers that the chapter might be bringing in a new line. Nobody officially said anything because everything seemed to be treated like a government secret, but people noticed little things. Certain upperclassmen started paying more attention to certain girls. Somebody might casually ask what your GPA was. Another person might ask whether you volunteered anywhere. And then one evening, I received a message from a senior named Simone asking if I could meet her for coffee. Simone was everything I thought a sorority woman was supposed to be. She was smart, beautiful, always put together, and she had already accepted a job offer for after graduation. Sitting across from her in that coffee shop, I felt like I was interviewing for my future. She asked me why I was interested in the organization, and I gave her the answer I had practiced in my head 100 times. Sisterhood, service, leadership, personal development. Those things were true, but there was another truth I didn't say out loud, which was that I wanted to belong to something important. Simone listened, smiled, and then told me something that I didn't fully understand until much later. She said, "Just remember, everything worth having requires sacrifice." At the time, I thought she meant studying harder, balancing events with classes, or giving up free time. I had no idea how many times I would hear that word over the next several weeks. A couple of weeks later, I learned I had been selected to move forward, and I remember screaming into my pillow because I didn't want anyone in the dorm hallway hearing me. There were 9 of us all together, and most of us already knew each other by face, even if we weren't really friends. Jasmine was studying nursing, Kiara was a communications major, Renee wanted to go to law school, and there was a quiet girl named Tasha who barely spoke above a whisper, but had almost a perfect GPA. At first, everything felt exciting. We talked about history, service, academics, leadership, and what it meant to represent something larger than ourselves. And for a while, it felt exactly like what I thought it would feel like. Then slowly, almost so gradually that I didn't notice it at first, things began to change. The messages started coming later at night. At first, it might be 9:30, then 11 o'clock, then after midnight. Someone would send a location and tell us to be there quickly, and nobody ever had to say directly what would happen if we didn't show up, because the implication was obvious. If you wanted to continue, you came. I remember one night asking Simone what happened if somebody had an exam the next morning, and she looked at me for a few seconds before saying, "Then I guess she'll learn time management." Everybody around her laughed, and I laughed too, even though something about it bothered me. That became one of the hardest parts for me to think about later, because there were so many moments when I laughed because everyone else laughed, or stayed quiet because everyone else stayed quiet. There were times when something inside me was already saying, "This doesn't feel right," but I kept convincing myself I was being dramatic. They started taking our phones during some meetings, telling us outsiders would never understand the process and that talking about it could create problems for everyone. We were constantly reminded that thousands of women would love to be where we were, and that people before us had supposedly endured far more. Anytime somebody questioned anything, it was treated like weakness, disrespect, or proof that she wasn't serious enough. One night, we were kept awake until almost sunrise, even though several of us had morning classes. Nothing happened that would look dramatic in a movie, but that was almost what made it worse. We were exhausted, standing there for hours, answering questions, being corrected, being embarrassed whenever somebody forgot something, and slowly watching 9 intelligent college women become scared to ask whether they could sit down. The next morning, I fell asleep during economics, and my professor woke me after class and asked if everything was okay. I looked him in the face and lied. I told him I had stayed up studying. The deeper we got into the process, the more everything outside of it started disappearing. I stopped going to lunch with friends because I never knew when somebody might message me. I stopped calling home as often because my mother could always hear when something was wrong, and I didn't want to explain something I barely understood myself. My roommate eventually looked at me one afternoon and said, "You look terrible." I laughed and told her thanks, but she wasn't joking. She told me I had lost weight and looked exhausted, and when I said I was just busy, she stared at me and asked, "With what? That sorority?" I didn't answer, and she shook her head and said, "Whatever y'all are doing, it ain't worth you end up looking like Miss Seeley." I got angry with her in that moment, but looking back, I think I was only angry because she had said out loud what I already knew. The first time I seriously thought about quitting was the night Tasha collapsed. We had been called to an off-campus house after midnight, and I'm not going to go into every detail of what happened inside because the important part is not giving anybody a blueprint for hazing. What matters is that we had been pushed physically and mentally for hours. Everyone was exhausted, and Tasha had already told one of the older women that she wasn't feeling well. Instead of letting her leave, somebody accused her of making excuses. A little while later, she hit the floor. The entire atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The same women who had been yelling seconds earlier suddenly looked terrified. Somebody grabbed water, somebody opened a window, and Simone crouched beside Tasha asking if she could hear her. I said we needed to call 911, and another woman snapped at me, "Nobody's calling anybody." I remember looking at her like she had lost her mind because Tasha was lying on the floor, and when I said she could be sick, the woman replied, "She's fine." I asked how she knew that, and that was probably the first time I openly challenged anyone involved in the process. Simone pulled me outside and told me I needed to understand that people were watching their chapter and that one misunderstanding could ruin years of work. I could barely believe what I was hearing. I told her Tasha was lying on somebody's floor, and Simone insisted they were handling it. I asked her what would happen if Tasha stopped breathing, and for the first time, I saw real fear on Simone's face because she didn't have an answer. Eventually, Tasha came around, and they drove her back to campus. The next morning, she told us she was okay, but she didn't come to the next meeting, or the one after that, and before long, her number disappeared from our group chat. Nobody gave us a real explanation. When I asked Jasmine what happened, she whispered that they said Tasha had quit. That should have been enough for me to walk away, but it wasn't. There is something dangerous about wanting something badly enough that you start negotiating with your own common sense. I told myself Tasha had made her choice and I would make mine, that I had already gone too far to quit, and that maybe we were almost finished. A few days later, I met a woman named Alicia in the library, and that conversation changed everything. I was sitting at a table trying to study when I noticed a woman across from me looking in my direction. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. Eventually, she packed up her laptop, walked over, and asked, "You pledging Theta?" I immediately thought I had somehow been exposed. I gave the response we had been trained to give and told her I didn't know what she was talking about. Alicia smiled, but not in a friendly way, and said, "Yeah, that's what we used to say too." She sat beside me and asked if I had ever heard the name Monique Carter. I hadn't. Alicia stared at me for a few seconds before saying, "That's exactly what I thought." She told me Monique had been a student at our school 2 years earlier, a smart psychology major who had been involved with Theta Rho Sigma. According to Alicia, something happened during that semester that nobody publicly called hazing. Monique suffered a serious medical emergency after an unofficial gathering. The university investigated, the chapter denied involvement, and Monique left school before the semester ended. Alicia had been her roommate, and when I asked why Monique left, Alicia looked me straight in the face and said, "Because she almost died." I asked why I had never heard anything about it, and Alicia gave a short laugh and said, "Because everybody got real good at keeping their mouths shut." She told me Monique's family had considered legal action, but eventually backed away, and the official explanation around campus was that Monique had withdrawn because of personal health problems. The chapter kept operating, although a few members had reportedly been disciplined internally. Then Alicia asked me a question I'll never forget. She said, "You think these girls care about you?" I didn't answer, and she leaned closer and said, "They care about protecting those letters." I left the library, unable to concentrate on anything, and later that night, I searched Monique's name online. At first I found nothing, but eventually I came across an old picture of her standing right on our campus in front of a building I recognized. I kept digging until I found an old post from her mother. It didn't mention a sorority or hazing. It simply said, "Sometimes protecting tradition becomes more important than protecting people." I stared at that sentence for a long time because suddenly everything felt different. From that point on, every meeting sounded different to me. Every speech about loyalty sounded less like sisterhood and more like control. Every reminder about sacrifice sounded darker. And every time somebody told us outsiders wouldn't understand, I wondered whether secrecy was the entire point. Then Renee broke down crying after missing a major assignment because we had been kept out late the night before. She told Simone she needed a break, and Simone replied, "Nobody forced you to be here." Technically, she was right, but everybody in that room understood how much pressure was being used against us. Walk away and you were weak. Walk away and you had wasted everybody's time. Walk away and people might whisper about you on campus. Walk away and the social circle you had spent years building might suddenly disappear. That was when I started to understand something I hadn't understood before. Nobody has to physically lock a door if they can convince you that leaving will cost you everything. A few nights later came the incident that finally broke the whole thing open. We were at another house off campus. Everybody was exhausted, and Jasmine started complaining that her chest felt strange. She kept touching the center of it and saying she couldn't catch her breath. At first, one of the older women accused her of being dramatic, but then Jasmine dropped to her knees. I didn't ask permission this time. I pulled out my phone, and when somebody moved toward me like she was going to stop me, I stepped back and told her that if she touched my phone, I was calling the police too. The room went completely silent, and I called 911. After that, everything happened fast. An ambulance came, and then campus police got involved because Jasmine was a student, and there were questions about why she had been at that house in the first place. A few of the older members started trying to coordinate everybody's stories, and Simone pulled me aside outside and told me I needed to think about what I was doing. I told her I was thinking clearly for the first time since the process started. She said I was emotional, and I told her I had been emotional when I wanted those letters badly enough to ignore what was happening. Then she looked at me and said, "If this chapter gets suspended, everybody will know why." That was the moment I stopped pretending there wasn't a threat underneath everything. I told the officer everything I knew. I wasn't suddenly fearless, and I didn't feel heroic. I was terrified, but I had already watched one girl collapse, another disappear from the process, another cry over her grades, and now Jasmine was being loaded into an ambulance. Somewhere along the way, I finally realized we weren't proving ourselves worthy of sisterhood. We were proving how much mistreatment we were willing to accept in exchange for belonging. The investigation lasted for weeks, and the university interviewed all of us. At first, several girls denied everything, and I understood why. Some were scared, some still wanted membership, some feared retaliation, and one girl told me her mother and grandmother belonged to the organization, and she couldn't imagine telling them what had happened. Then Tasha spoke. After Tasha spoke, Renee spoke. Jasmine eventually told investigators what happened after she recovered, and little by little, most of us started telling the truth. The chapter was suspended while the university investigated, and several students faced disciplinary action. There were also questions about whether alumni had known unofficial activities were happening off campus. For months afterward, campus felt different to me. People stared. I lost friends. One girl I had known since freshman orientation walked past me in the student center and called me a snitch, just loud enough for me to hear it. Another person sent me a message saying I had destroyed something black women had spent generations building. That one hurt because I respected the history, and I still do, but protecting history cannot mean protecting abuse. I almost transferred because the pressure became so heavy, and my mother wanted me home the minute she found out what happened. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed while she cried through the phone, asking why I hadn't told her sooner. I didn't have a good answer. Maybe I was embarrassed. Maybe I knew she would tell me to leave and I didn't want to. Maybe I had gotten so wrapped up in proving I belonged that I forgot I already did. That semester became the lowest point of my college experience, but something unexpected happened too. People started reaching out privately. Former students, women from other schools, and people who had gone through similar experiences years earlier began telling me things they had never said publicly. Some said they still had nightmares about what happened to them. One woman told me she had never even told her husband what she experienced during her process. Another said she dropped out of college afterward and spent years blaming herself for not being strong enough. That was when I understood this story was much bigger than me. There were generations of people who had been taught that suffering was simply part of earning acceptance, and somewhere along the way, pain had been confused with loyalty. I want to make something clear because people always misunderstand stories like this. I am not against sororities, I am not against fraternities, and I am definitely not against any HBCU. I love my HBCU. Some of the greatest years of my life happened there. Professors at that school changed the direction of my life. Friends I met there are still like family to me. And walking across that graduation stage remains one of my proudest memories. But loving something does not mean pretending nothing bad can ever happen inside it. Sometimes loving a community means being willing to tell the truth about the parts that need to change. I graduated 2 years later. Jasmine graduated too. Renee eventually went to law school, and Tasha transferred but finished her degree somewhere else. As for Simone, I saw her one last time during my senior year at homecoming. Thousands of people were walking around campus, music was everywhere, alumni were hugging, vendors were selling shirts, and the band was warming up somewhere in the distance. Simone was standing near the student center talking with several women, and for a second, our eyes met. Neither one of us said anything. She looked away, and I kept walking. Years later, I still think about that 18-year-old girl who first arrived on campus believing belonging was something somebody else had to give her. I wish I could sit down with her for 5 minutes and tell her what I know now. I would tell her that any group, relationship, organization, or tradition that requires you to destroy yourself before they accept you is not giving you belonging. They are testing how much of yourself you are willing to surrender, and no letters, title, friendship, relationship, or tradition is worth your life. That's why I'm finally telling this story. I'm not telling you the HBCU, I'm not telling you the real organization, and I'm not telling this because I want people trying to guess which campus it happened on. The name of the school is not the important part. The important part is that when I entered college, I thought surviving my HBCU meant passing classes, paying tuition, staying focused, and making it through 4 years. I never imagined the thing I would really have to survive was my own desperation to belong.
Vehicle, can you send him over, patrol? Cover that, we have a neighbor calling. 8482, we're at Chicago Avenue, we need a rescue team. Over. Copy that. We have to change you over to channel 2.